Hi, it's Miss Lisa from the St. Paris Public Library. Welcome back to another week of Just Before Bed, our chapter book reading program for the summer. We are going to start a new story tonight called The Fantastic Secret of Owen Jester. The author is Barbara O'Connor. Here's the picture on the front. Looks like it's going to be a good read. So we're going to get started tonight, and we're going to start in chapter 1. Owen Jester tiptoed across the gleaming linoleum floor and slipped the frog into the soup. It swam gracefully under the potatoes, pushing its froggy legs through the pale yellow broth. It circled the carrots and bumped into the celery and finally settled beside a parsnip, its bulging eyes staring unblinkingly up at Owen. "See, Tully, I told you," Owen said. "It's not hot." He plucked a carrot out of the soup and popped it into his mouth. Still cold. Not yet heated up for his grandfather's supper. Owen scurried into the pantry and hunkered down on the floor among the sacks of potatoes and jars of pickled okra and waited for Erlene. When he heard the clomp-clomp of her heavy black shoes on the wooden stairs, he slapped a hand over his mouth to stifle a giggle. When he heard the kitchen door swing open, he slapped his other hand over his mouth, his shoulders shaking with a silent laugh. Then he peeked through the crack in the pantry door. Erlene stomped over to the stove in that no-nonsense way of hers. She picked up a wooden spoon from the kitchen counter and peered into the pot. Then she placed the spoon back on the counter, stepped away from the stove, jammed both fists into her waist, and said, "Owen!" Her voice had that sharp edge to it that Owen had heard so many times before. He ducked back against the pantry wall and held his breath. And then, quick as lightning, the pantry door burst open and Erlene's hand shot in, grabbed Owen by the collar and yanked him to his feet. Erlene was not a yeller. Erlene was a snapper. "Get that frog out of there," she snapped. "You think that's funny?" she snapped. She gave his collar a shake. "You are a bad, bad child," she snapped, "and I thank my lucky stars every day that you are not mine." She gave his collar another shake. "And I thank the good Lord up above that your grandfather doesn't know what's going on in this house." She stomped over to the counter and began arranging pill bottles on a tray. "The very idea of that poor sick old man up there in bed not able to do a thing but sleep and eat applesauce, and you don't think you down here thinking up ways to make my life miserable." Erlene sure knew how to ruin a good time. After supper, Owen sat on his closet floor beside the plastic tub where Tully lived and looked down at the frog. Tully was the biggest, greenest, slimiest, most beautiful bullfrog ever to have been seen in Carter, Georgia. It had taken Owen nearly a month to catch him. A month of clomping through mud and scooping with his fish nets and buckets and colanders and even a hamster cage. A month of squatting on logs, holding his breath, not moving a muscle, watching that big frog with his heart-shaped red spot between his bulging yellow eyes. A month of telling his friends, Travis and Stumpy, he was going to catch that frog no matter what. And then one day, just last week, he did. The right scoop with the right net at the right time. He had brought the frog home and made him a perfect frog house in a plastic tub in the closet, and he had named him Tully Graham. Tully, after his cousin who lived in Alabama and played in a rock and roll band and wore leather bracelets and made everyone mad when he came to Georgia to visit the family at Thanksgiving. Everyone but Owen, who thought Tully was cool. And Graham, after the big pond where the bullfrog had lived before Owen caught him. Graham Pond. Owen poked the frog with his finger. "Come on, Tully," he said. "You gotta eat something." But Tully wouldn't even look at the dead fly that Owen had dropped into the water in the tub. So Owen laid the chicken wire back on top of the tub, put a brick on top of the chicken wire, and flopped onto his bed, staring at the ceiling. Travis and Stumpy were probably skateboarding over at Buy Low parking lot. Maybe they were throwing rocks at the Quaker State oil sign on Highway 11. Or maybe they were thinking of some great new ways to torture their dreaded enemy, Viola. But Owen was stuck here in his bedroom, thanks to Erlene, who had tattled on him big time as soon as his mother had gotten home from work. He could tell his mother had thought that soup trick was at least a little bit funny. He had seen the corners of her mouth twitch when Erlene went on and on about what a bad, bad boy he was. But his mother had told his father, and his father had slammed his fist on the kitchen table and hollered at Owen, and now here he was, in his bedroom, just him and Tully. Owen wished they had never moved in with his grandfather. He wished they still lived in that little house over on Tupelo Road. Travis had lived next door, and Stumpy had lived across the street, and life had been good. But then the hardware store had closed, and his father didn't have a job, so they had moved across town to live with his grandfather. There were 3 good things and 3 bad things about living with grandfather. The 3 good things were, number 1, there was a lot of land around the house with woods and paths and sheds and big pond where Tully had lived. Number 2, there was a falling down barn behind the house that was filled with stuff, like a rusty unicycle and a crate full of horseshoes and about 100 rolls of chicken wire. Number 3, train tracks ran behind the woods below the house, and every few days the train whistle blew late at night as the train roared through Carter. Now, the 3 bad things were, Erlene had been working for his grandfather for as long as Owen had been alive, maybe longer. Erlene was grumpy and needed everything to be clean. Number 2, Travis and Stumpy lived farther away and sometimes did things without him. And number 3, Viola lived next door. Owen did not like Viola. There were a lot of reasons why he did not like Viola, but the first 4 were, number 1, Viola was nosy. Number 2, Viola was bossy. Number 3, Viola wore glasses that made her eyes look big like a fly's. And number 4, Viola was a know-it-all. There was only one good thing about Viola. She had allergies. Viola was allergic to pine and grass and dust and dogs and just about every good thing in life. This was a good thing because it meant that Viola didn't like to play in the woods or the fields or down by the pond, and she never went inside Owen's grandfather's house, where Owen's dogs, Pete and Leroy, left tumbleweeds of fur along the baseboards of every room. Owen checked on Tully one more time before he turned off the lamp beside the bed. Then he sat by the window and took a deep breath of the summer night air. It smelled like pine and grass and honeysuckle. Far off in the distance, the train whistle blew. Owen waited, listening for the faint clatter of the train on the tracks to get louder and louder as it got closer to Carter. In a blink, the train was whooshing down the tracks behind the house. Clatter, clatter, clatter. And then something else. A noise Owen had never heard before, from far away by the tracks. A thud. The crack of wood. A tumble, tumble, tumble sound. Then the clatter, clatter, clatter of the train grew fainter and fainter until the only sound left was the chirp of the crickets in the garden beneath the window. I think it sounds like something fell off the train. Chapter 2. He's sad. He is not. He is too. He is not. Owen stamped his foot and glared at Viola. He reached into the cardboard box and nudged the grasshopper closer to Tully. The frog didn't move. Besides, Viola said, frogs only eat bugs that are alive. She stepped closer to Owen. Everyone knows that, she added. Owen quickly stepped aside before Viola's pudgy white arm could touch him. Your mother's calling you, he said. Viola reached into the box and stroked Tully's back with one finger. You should let him go, she said. Well, that just proved what Owen had known all along. Viola was dumb. You're dumb, Owen said. What kind of person would go to all the trouble to catch the best frog in Carter, Georgia, and turn around and let it go? A nice person, Viola said. A good person? A kind person? Your mother's calling you, Owen said again. You're mean, Owen. Viola tossed her stringy hair over her shoulder, adjusted her glasses, wiped grass off the back of her shorts, and stalked off to the hedge that separated her backyard from Owen's grandfather's. Then, just before disappearing through the opening at the bottom of the hedge, she turned around and added, and that frog is sad. Owen scooped Tully up and held him close to his face. You're not sad, are you, fella? He said. He examined the frog. his shiny skin, his yellow throat, his froggy toes. Owen glanced over at the hedge to make sure Viola was gone. Then he whispered to Tully, "You want a live bug?" Tully wiggled a little bit and placed a webbed foot on Owen's cheek. "Me and Travis and Stumpy will find you some big old juicy ones," Owen said. Then he took Tully over to the back porch and placed him in the outside frog house, a plastic tub under the stairs. The outside frog house was just like the inside frog house, only bigger, so Tully had more room to swim. Owen had put a log in the tub for Tully to sit on and added some magnolia leaves that floated on the water like lily pads. On his way over to Tupelo Road, Owen worried about Tully. He wouldn't eat. He didn't jump like he had at first. He didn't swim like he had at first. His eyes didn't seem quite as shiny and his skin didn't seem quite as smooth. But mixed in with the worry about Tully was some thinking. Owen kept thinking about the noise he had heard last night, that thud, that crack of wood, that tumble, tumble, tumble sound. Something had fallen off the train. Owen was sure of it. He had planned to dash down to the tracks first thing this morning and look for it. But then Viola had crawled through the opening in the hedge and stuck her nosy nose into his business and said all that stuff about Tully being sad, and now he had to find some live bugs. But he couldn't stop thinking about the noise or wondering if he was right about something falling off the train. And if something had fallen off the train, what in the world could it be? Chapter 3. "How much do bullfrogs eat?" Travis said. Owen cupped his hands over the cricket. "Got him!" He dropped the cricket into the jar. "That's 5, he said. "That should be enough." "What about this?" Stumpy held up a fat, muddy worm. "Nah," Owen said. "I don't think frogs eat worms." Stumpy tossed the worm into the flower bed and wiped his hands on his shorts. "Maybe we could build a cage for Tully," Travis said. He took his baseball cap off, swished it around in the water in the bird bath, and put it back on. Ew. Bird bath water is dirty sometimes. Dirty water ran down the side of his face and dripped onto his shirt. "Y'all get out of my garden," Jolene Burkus hollered out the window. The boys ran through the gate, trampling marigolds and tripping on cantaloupe vines, till they reached Stumpy's yard. Jolene Burkus had moved into the house where Owen used to live. She had torn down Owen's fort and made a garden. She had hauled off all the car parts on the back porch and put a rocking chair there. She had painted right over Jester on the mailbox and stenciled on Burkus in perfect black letters. And now she spent the livelong day hollering at Owen and Travis and Stumpy every time they set foot in her yard, which used to be Owen's. "Maybe we could build a cage," Travis repeated as they flopped down on Stumpy's front steps to examine the crickets. "What kind of cage?" Owen said. "A cage in the pond." Travis tapped on the side of the cricket jar. "A cage in the pond? That wasn't a half bad idea. We could use that chicken wire in the barn," Owen said. "Yeah," Stumpy said. "Bugs and stuff could get right through it. And we could make a door so we could take him out," Owen said. And so the boys planned. They planned how big the cage would be and where they would put it and where they would get the things they would need to build it. All afternoon they planned, and the more they planned, the better Owen felt about Tully. Owen had been busy planning. He had forgotten about the noise, the thud, the crack of wood, the tumble, tumble, tumble sound. But that evening at the supper table, he remembered. "I'm going outside," he said, pushing his chair back with a scrape and heading for the door. His father didn't even look up from his pork chop. His mother said, "Be back before dark." Erlene squinted over at him from the sink and muttered something under her breath about bad manners and green beans. The two dogs, Pete and Leroy, leaped off the porch after Owen, and the three of them raced across the yard, into the woods, and along the path towards the train tracks. Owen had explored every inch of the woods and fields around his grandfather's house. The main path zigzagged around trees and boulders to the middle of the woods. Then it forked. The path to the left led to the field full of weeds and pricker bushes, then continued on down to a tilted, rotting dock at Graham Pond. The path to the right led around the pond to the train tracks on the other side. Owen was not allowed to go down to the train tracks. Travis and Stumpy were not allowed to go down to the train tracks. Owen and Travis and Stumpy went down to the train tracks nearly every day. That's not a good idea. They had put up about $1 million worth of pennies on the tracks for a train. Wait, let me read that again. They had put about $1 million worth of pennies on the tracks for the trains to flatten, and a few nickels and quarters, too. One time, Stumpy had put a liverwurst sandwich on the track, and when they went back the next day, not a crumb was left. They had walked right up the middle of the tracks all the way to the main road and back again. They had put their ears against the metal rail to listen for the train, but the train only came late at night. "Come on, boys," Owen called to Pete and Leroy when he got to the end of the path at the tracks. The two dogs trotted along behind him, sniffing at every tree and rock and pricker bush. Owen looked up at the tracks. Then he looked down the tracks. Nothing unusual, just the same stuff he saw nearly every day. The mound of red dirt that ran beside the tracks, gravel, weeds, few rusty soda cans, a broken bottle. Nothing unusual. "Shoot," Owen said out loud, making Pete and Leroy look at him and cock their heads. Owen had wanted to find whatever it was that had fallen off the train all by himself. But maybe he should tell Travis and Stumpy. Owen and Travis and Stumpy had always been good at finding stuff together. But then there was the problem of nosy Viola, lurking around, following them, spying on them. He would have to wait until just the right time to tell Travis and Stumpy. "Come on, boys," Owen called again to Pete and Leroy. Then he headed back up the path towards home, with the two dogs trotting behind him. Chapter 4. "Shh!" Owen pressed a finger to his lips and motioned for Travis and Stumpy to duck behind the barn. He peeked through a crack in the warped boards. Viola was tromping across the yard, swinging a Girl Scout canteen with one hand and pushing at her glasses with the other. "Dang," Owen whispered. "She's coming this way." Travis jabbed a finger up towards the hayloft. Owen nodded. The three boys dashed across the dirt floor of the barn and scurried up the rickety ladder to the loft. They flopped down on their stomachs, their cheeks pressed against the hay-covered floor, and waited. "I know y'all are in here, there, Owen." Viola's irritating voice drifted into the barn. Travis poked Owen with an elbow, and Stumpy made a little snort noise. Owen flapped a hand at both of them and mouthed, "Be quiet." Viola's sandals made a slapping noise as she entered the barn and stopped at the bottom of the ladder. "I know y'all are in here." That irritating voice slithered up the ladder and circled around Owen. "Dang, that girl sure was annoying. What are y'all doing?" The voice pounded Owen on the back of the head. The slapping sandals moved away from the ladder and shuffled over to the corner of the barn. "What are y'all building?" Owen lifted his head the teeny tiniest bit and peered over the edge of the loft. Viola was rummaging through the stuff that he and Travis and Stumpy had spent all morning gathering. Rolls of chicken wire, tomato steaks, baling wire, twine, old door hinges. Viola poked at the roll of chicken wire. "I know what you all are building," she said. Travis pursed his lips and glared down at Viola. Stumpy's eyes grew big and round as he looked at Owen in that "what now" kind of way. Owen crawled to the rear of the loft until he got to a milk crate full of old tractor parts. He grabbed a greasy rubber fan belt, a handful of rusty nuts and bolts, and a broken gauge of some sort. Then he crawled back to the edge of the loft and began flinging the things down to the barn floor, trying to get as close to Viola as possible without actually hitting her. The bolts made pinging noises as they hit garden tools and engine parts and ricocheted off the wheelbarrow and the lawnmower. The gauge skidded over the dirt floor and hit the wall of the barn with a crash, followed by the tinkle of broken glass. The fan belt landed right on Viola's sandal. She jerked her foot away and gazed coolly up at Owen. "Y'all are building something for that sad old frog," she said, giving her glasses a nudge up the bridge of her nose with her thumb. "His name is Tully, and he's not sad," Owen called down from the loft. Viola picked up the fan belt and whirled it around her finger. "Frogs don't have names." "Says who?" Travis hollered down at Viola. Stumpy pushed some hay off the edge of the loft. Yeah, says who, he said. Viola brushed hay out of her hair and glared up at the boys. Says me and anyone else on the planet with half a brain. She tossed the fan belt onto the pile of chicken wire. Frogs don't have names and don't want names. Frogs want to be frogs and live where frogs are supposed to live. Oh, yeah, Travis said. Oh, yeah, Stumpy said. Your mother's calling you, Owen said. As soon as the words left his mouth, Owen's stomach clenched up into a ball of angry. Why did he have to go and say that again? First of all, he said it all the time. Second of all, Viola never even blinked an eye when he said it, so what was the point? And third of all, Viola's mother never called her. Viola's mother never did anything but sit on the porch in her bathrobe looking at magazines. The only time Owen had ever seen Viola's mom step 1 foot off her porch was the time she went to the flea market and came back with a bunch of tiki torches. Viola had told him that tiki torches were for a Hawaiian luau party. Owen had peeked through the hedge every day for nearly a week to see the Hawaiian luau party, but all he ever saw was a pile of tiki torches and a barbecue grill full of rainwater. Viola pushed aside the tomato stakes with the toe of her sandal. She inspected a tangled roll of baling wire. She squinted through her thick glasses at the rusty door hinges. Y'all are building a cage, she said. Owen hurried down the ladder and grabbed the door hinges from her. He jammed them into his pocket and said, Go away. Yeah, go away. Travis jumped off the last rung of the ladder and stood between Viola and the pile of stuff. His feet spread, his arms folded, his chin stuck out. Stumpy jumped from halfway down the ladder and landed on the barn floor with an oomph. You don't really need hinges, you know, Viola nodded back towards the baling wire, and staples would work better than that wire. Staples are for paper, you ninny, Travis said. Yeah, Stumpy said. Staples are for paper, you ninny. But Owen stayed quiet. He was trying to keep his irritation from getting the best of him and turning him into a foot-stomping baby. But it was hard, because he knew Viola was right about the staples. And he knew she didn't mean staples like the little ones for paper. She meant those heavy-duty kind like his father used to staple plastic over the windows in the winter at their old house on Tupelo Road. I know where there's a staple gun, Viola said, grabbing her canteen off the hay bale. She turned to Owen and looked smug. Owen hated it when Viola looked smug. More than anything, he wanted to say where. But he knew that Viola wanted him to say where, which was why she was looking so smug. So instead of saying where, Owen said rocket. Rocket was the secret code word that he and Travis and Stumpy had made up to ditch Viola. They had agreed that if one of them said rocket, they would all run as fast as they could to their hiding place down by the train tracks. So that's what they did. They ran as fast as they could out of the barn, across the yard, down the path, through the woods, and around the pond. They crossed to the other side of the tracks, pushed their way through the scrubby bushes, and crawled up under the branches of an enormous rotten oak tree that had fallen years ago and landed against a pine tree, forming a perfect teepee. The boys were gasping and laughing and high-fiving each other when Pete and Leroy came sniffing through the brush, tails wagging, nose sniffing. Uh-oh, Owen said. I hope Viola didn't follow them. Owen crawled out of the tree teepee and looked around. No sign of Viola. Good, he thought. Then the time had come. He was going to tell Travis and Stumpy about the thing that had fallen off the train. Chapter 5. The boys looked all afternoon. They combed the woods. They tromped through pricker bushes. They waded along the edges of the pond, their feet sinking in the gooey mud. They found a plastic milk crate with the bottom broken out. They found a coffee can full of mud. They found a piece of PVC pipe with property of Monroe County stamped on the side. And they found an old metal thing with a rusty bolt sticking out of it. But none of these things seemed like something that would have fallen off the train and made the noise that Owen heard, the thud, the crack of wood, the tumble, tumble, tumble sound. Are you sure the noise came from around here? Travis said, tossing a handful of rocks into the pond. Sure, I'm sure, Owen said. I mean, maybe it was farther up that way, Travis nodded up the tracks. Maybe it wasn't near the pond. Owen shrugged. Maybe. Then you know what that means, Stumpy said. Owen and Travis looked at Stumpy and waited. That means it could be up yonder behind Viola's house, Stumpy set his mouth in a hard line and drew his eyebrows together. A deep, dead, gloomy silence fell over them. They stared at their shoes, their hands shoved in their pockets. Suddenly, Owen's head shot up and he snapped his fingers. Allergies, he hollered, grinning. Travis and Stumpy stared at Owen. Viola never goes back that far, Owen said. There's weeds and stuff back there. She hates that. She sneezes and gets sick and all. He shook his head. Nah, Viola won't be nosing around here. Owen looked up the tracks. He knew every inch of them, how they curved slightly just beyond the pond, then continued on through the fields way in the back of Viola's house. After that, they went over the main highway, out of Carter and into Fort Valley, out of Fort Valley and into Byron, out of Byron and into Macon, and on, clear on through the state of Georgia. As the sun sank lower, the sky grew darker. The boys agreed to come back to the tracks and look some more if they could ditch that nosy Viola. Then they headed back towards Owen's house to catch mosquitoes for Tully. Here you go, Tully, Owen said. These are yummy. He opened the peanut butter jar and released 3 mosquitoes into the frog house in the closet. Then he spread a piece of newspaper over the top of the plastic tub to keep the mosquitoes from escaping. He waited. He listened, hoping to hear Tully hopping around inside catching the mosquitoes, but it was quiet. Owen lifted the corner of the newspaper and peeked inside. Tully sat on the branch. The mosquitoes flitted around the plastic tub. One of them landed on the branch right beside Tully, but the big green frog didn't move. Not even one little bit. Owen sighed. He reached into the tub and lifted the bullfrog out. He examined Tully's yellow throat, his webbed feet, his froggy face with the heart-shaped red spot between his eyes. Owen got an icky feeling in the pit of his stomach. Tully did look a little sad. Owen set the frog down on the floor beside the bed. He waited. Tully didn't jump. Owen nudged him a little. Tully didn't jump. The first time Owen had set Tully down on his bedroom floor, the frog had jumped clear across the room in one giant leap. Owen sighed again. He scooped Tully up and put him back on the branch in the frog house. He covered the frog house with the chicken wire and the brick, then went over to look out the window. The moon cast a soft glow on the yard and the woods out back. The night was quiet for a few minutes, and then the faint clatter of the train drifted into the silence. Louder, 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 clatter, clatter, clatter. The train roared by and then was gone. But this time there was no thud, no crack of wood, no tumble, tumble, tumble sound. Owen tried to imagine something in the bushes or the gully or the woods somewhere out there beside the tracks. Something had fallen off the train, but what? What had fallen off the train, and where was it? Owen was determined to find it. At first, he and Travis and Stumpy were going to have to build that cage for Tully. It would be the best frog cage ever. It would be big enough for swimming and jumping. Half of it would be out of the water with logs and leaves and squishy mud to sit on. The other half would be in the water with room for Tully to swim in big, big circles, kicking his froggy legs the livelong day. And a whole parade of water bugs and grasshoppers and crickets and flies would go right through the chicken wire sides of the cage, and Tully would gobble them up, and Tully would not be sad. Chapter 6. Owen tucked the duct tape under his t-shirt, motioned for Pete and Leroy, and tried to open the screen door so it wouldn't squeak. He failed. The screen door squeaked, and Erlene's harsh voice thundered through the front hallway. "Where are you going?" "Out yonder," Owen called back. Erlene stormed into the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron and shaking her ugly old head. "You're going nowhere till you sweep up every crumb of dirt and blade of grass you tracked in here last night. I don't know why on God's green earth you can't take your shoes off like I've told you 1,000,000 times. And she yammered on, but all Owen heard was blah, blah, blah. He let out a big heavy sigh and trudged to the broom closet. What's that under your shirt? Arlene said, squinting over at him. Nothing. The duct tape fell out from under his shirt and rolled across the kitchen floor. Arlene snatched it up and shook it at Owen. What are you doing with this? Nothing. Arlene's face turned red as fire as she shoved the duct tape back into the junk drawer. The whole time he was sweeping up dirt and grass, Arlene stood stiffly beside him, her fist jammed into her waist and the toe of her clunky shoe tap, tap, tapping on the floor while she yammered some more. Her voice swirled around the room like a horde of angry bees. Owen hummed to himself very, very quietly, so Arlene wouldn't hear. His humming helped him turn Arlene's words into a steady buzz, but every now and then a word tumbled out of the whirling buzz. Frog, mud, disgusting, trouble, noise. Owen hummed a little louder so he could shut out all of Arlene's words and think. He thought about meeting Travis and Stumpy out in the barn. He thought about putting all the chicken wire and tomato steaks and stuff into the wheelbarrow, taking it down to the pond. He thought about how to keep Viola from sticking her nosy nose into his business and ruining all his fun. Hurry up, Owen called over his shoulder as he scurried down the path towards the pond, the hinges and baling wire banging and clanging as they bounced in the bottom of the wheelbarrow. Travis and Stumpy huffed and puffed beside him, dragging a roll of chicken wire that left a trail in the pine needles scattered along the path. When they got to the pond, they stopped, panting, wiping sweat off their brows. I was thinking we should attach the cage to the dock, Owen said. That way we can reach it without getting in the water. Travis and Stumpy nodded in agreement, so the boys dumped the stuff in the weeds beside the dock and set to work building a cage for Tully. But they didn't have wire cutters to cut the wire. They didn't have a saw to cut the tomato steaks. They didn't have a plan. We need a plan, Owen said. Yeah, Travis said. Yeah, Stumpy said. Owen tossed the hinges into the wheelbarrow. Let's hide this stuff in the bushes and go to Stumpy's and make a plan, he said. While Jolene Burkus glared over at them from her glider on the porch, Owen and Travis and Stumpy sat on the sidewalk in front of Stumpy's house and made a plan for the frog cage on notebook paper. First, they made a list of the tools they would need, like wire cutters and a staple gun and a saw. Then they drew a picture of the cage, showing the measurements for each of the sides and where the door would go. They drew and wrote and drew and wrote, and then a short, fat shadow fell across the paper. The boys looked up. Viola stared down at them with her big fly eyes through her thick glasses. I know what you're doing, she said. Owen looked back down at the notebook paper, pretended like he didn't see her chubby white legs standing there beside him. Jarvis has a staple gun, Viola said. Jarvis is a worm-headed doofus, Travis said. Stumpy slapped his knee and snorted. Jarvis was Viola's brother, who sometimes went to high school and sometimes worked in a sign painting shop over in Fort Valley. He was pale and freckly and wore thick glasses that gave him fly eyes like Viola's. You shouldn't use hinges, Viola said. They'll get too rusty. Do you hear somebody talking? Travis said to Owen. I don't hear a thing, Owen said. How about you, Stumpy? Not one dang little thing, Stumpy said. Me neither, Travis said. Not even a bossy toad-brained who thinks she knows everything there is to know about everything on the planet. The boys huddled over their drawings on the notebook paper on the sidewalk and didn't look up. Owen pretended like he wasn't irritated at all, get out at Viola. And he pretended like it hadn't suddenly occurred to him that Viola was right. Using hinges wasn't a good idea. Maybe it would be better to use the baling wire to attach the top of the cage so it could be opened and closed. He gathered up the paper and motioned for Travis and Stumpy to follow him. The three boys trotted off towards Owen's grandfather's house, leaving Viola behind. The boys worked on the frog cage down by the pond all afternoon. Every now and then, Owen ran up to the house to check on Tully, who sat motionless in the frog house under the back stairs. Every time Owen checked, Tully was sitting in the same spot on top of a soggy magnolia leaf. Every time Owen poked him with a finger, every time Tully blinked one long, slow blink, but didn't move. Owen tried to nudge Tully so he would swim around the tub like he used to, but Tully wouldn't swim. So Owen raced back down to the pond to work on the cage some more. If they could finish the cage today, they could put it in the water, and Tully could move right in and be happy. And then, first thing tomorrow morning, he could meet Travis and Stumpy down by the tracks, and they could look for the thing that had fallen off the train.